The Battle of Coronel, fought on the 1st of November 1914, was the first defeat for the Royal Navy in over 100 years. So, where was it fought, and what exactly happened? The first major naval action of World War I between the British and Germans didn't take place in the North Sea, or indeed anywhere else in Europe, but in the cold oceans of South America. And it brought to a shuddering halt Britannia's belief that she ruled the waves. The story of the Battle of Coronel starts on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. Before the First World War, Germany's East Asia Squadron was based at their treaty port of Tsingtao on the coast of China. It was commanded by Vice Admiral Maximilian von Spee. Hailing from an aristocratic family, the 60-year-old admiral had joined the Imperial Navy in 1878. His first visit to China had been while serving with the German forces during the Boxer Rebellion. Now, as commander, he'd raised his flag on the armoured cruiser SMS Scharnhorst in 1912. The Scharnhorst was one of 5 armoured cruisers in his East Asia squadron. When war broke out, von Spee and 3 of his cruisers were in the German-controlled Caroline Islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. With the imminent entry of Japan on the Allied side, returning to the main base at Tsingtao was not a viable option, which left the German admiral with 2 alternatives. The first was to sail into the Indian Ocean, attacking British colonies and shipping, including troop convoys heading out from Australia, New Zealand and India towards Europe. The second option was to sail eastwards across the Pacific Ocean, where he could attack Allied shipping down the west coast of the Americas, and hopefully receive supplies from sympathetic ports, not least in Chile, where there was a sizable German population. He opted for this latter course of action, although he did allow one of his cruisers, the Emden, to strike out into the Indian Ocean. And I've told the story of the Emden in a previous video, which I will share with you at the end of this story. Meanwhile, the Allies were completely in the dark as to where von Spee was. It wasn't until the 14th of September that his fleet suddenly appeared off the island of Samoa. Von Spee found that the German colony was now a former German colony, having been occupied by New Zealand forces 2 weeks beforehand. Sailing away, he then appeared off the French island of Tahiti on the 22nd of September, proceeding to bombard the capital, sinking a French gunboat in the process. And then in mid-October, the German admiral and his ships were sighted off Easter Island. Here, his fleet were joined by the light cruisers Leipzig, which had steamed south from the coastline of California, and the Dresden, which had rounded Cape Horn from the Atlantic. This now brought them up against the Royal Navy's North America and West Indies squadron, commanded by Rear Admiral Sir Christopher Craddock. A year younger than von Spee, Craddock had joined the Royal Navy in 1875. He had served with the Naval Brigade during the Mahdist Wars, during and shortly after the attempts to rescue General Charles Gordon in Khartoum, and had, just like von Spee, seen action during the Boxer Rebellion. Craddock was now ordered to intercept von Spee. The good news, or so the Admiralty in London thought, was that he was already close at hand. Back in August, he'd sailed south from Halifax, Nova Scotia, to the South Atlantic to eliminate the German raider, the Dresden. Whilst taking on supplies at the Falkland Islands, he'd received a message telling him that the Dresden had rounded Cape Horn and had now joined von Spee off Easter Island. The bad news for the Admiralty was that the small squadron that he had with him was not a match against the Germans. Craddock was sailing aboard his flagship, HMS Good Hope. Her firepower consisted of 2 9.2-inch guns plus 16 outdated 6-inch guns. He was accompanied by the slightly smaller armoured cruiser, HMS Monmouth. She too carried 14 of the same outdated 6-inch guns. The Monmouth was captained by Frank Brand, who had just celebrated his 43rd birthday. His attempts to retire a few years earlier had been refused, because he was seen as an expert on the newfangled submarines. So, somewhat ironic that he now found himself not in charge of submarines or anti-submarine warfare, but stuck down in the South Atlantic on what was regarded very much as a second-class warship. Indeed, both the Monmouth and the Good Hope had been on the reserve when the war broke out, and consequently, both of their crews were principally made up of men from the Navy Reserve, including 4 young cadets drafted onto HMS Good Hope from the Royal Canadian Naval College. Craddock's fleet was supported by the smaller but more modern light cruiser HMS Glasgow, armed with 2 6-inch and 10 4-inch guns. He was also joined by the armed merchant cruiser Otranto, whose role was to take on similar enemy vessels, in other words, armed German merchant cruisers, rather than the warships that they were about to face. Von Spee's fleet, on the other hand, consisted of the Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau, both armed with 8 8.2-inch guns and 6 5.9-inch guns. SMS Leipzig, completed in 1906, was armed with 10 4.1-inch guns. The recently arrived SMS Dresden had similar armaments, as did the final warship under his command, SMS Nürnberg. Now, there had been discussion in London about reinforcing Craddock, but the only warship he received was the pre-dreadnought HMS Canopus. Despite the Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, proclaiming that the Canopus was a citadel on the sea, the reality was that whilst the 13,000-ton battleship could outrange the Germans with her 4 12-inch guns, she was obsolete. Indeed, she was scheduled to be scrapped in 1915. Moreover, Canopus, never a fast ship, was slowed down by repeated mechanical problems. And this was the fleet that the Royal Navy sent against von Spee's squadron, which included 2 cruisers whose crews had won the Kaiser's prize for shooting. The only glimmer of hope for Admiral Craddock was that HMS Defence, a modern cruiser, had also been promised, although there was no sign of her yet. And there wouldn't be. Because, despite promising Craddock the cruiser, the Admiralty now did a U-turn, and unfortunately they failed to inform Craddock about the new reality. And this indeed was synonymous of the difficulty in communicating between London and ships on the high seas in the southern oceans, along also with some ambiguous communications which really didn't help matters. Believing that he was acting under admittedly ambiguous orders from London, Craddock left the Falklands on the 22nd of October and sailed round the Cape Horn into the Pacific. Almost immediately, HMS Canopus, with her continuing engine troubles, started to slow down his search for von Spee. Craddock had the first of several dilemmas that he was to face as the ensuing drama unfolded. Whilst useful in a battle because of her big guns, Canopus would also slow down his fleet, making any engagement less likely, as von Spee would simply speed away, or even worse, steam past them into the Atlantic. He ordered Canopus to escort his colliers and follow him as best she could. And now, with the rest of his fleet, he increased speed, heading up the coast of Chile, leaving Canopus 300 miles in his wake. As he did so, he transmitted a message to London, stating that without the Canopus, his force was insufficient to take on von Spee's squadron. Nevertheless, he would do his duty and hope that he could get the opportunity to pick off the German ships one at a time. Craddock had sent HMS Glasgow ahead, and on the 31st of August, whilst in the Chilean port of Valparaiso, she intercepted strong German naval messages. From the call signs, Captain John Luce identified the ship as the Leipzig. Unbeknown to the captain of the Glasgow, he was actually listening to messages from the whole of von Spee's squadron. They were all using the Leipzig's call to throw the Royal Navy off the scent. Meanwhile, that night, von Spee learned of the Glasgow's presence at Valparaiso. He immediately ordered his fleet to steam towards the port, planning to arrive just after Glasgow's allowed time in neutral port had expired. However, Captain Luce, in his eagerness to inform Craddock, sailed as soon as possible. So when von Spee arrived on the morning of the 1st of November, he was left looking at an open harbour, except for his own ships. By 1:15 p.m, HMS Glasgow had rendezvoused with the Good Hope. Captain Luce informed Admiral Craddock of the radio messages from the Leipzig. This was exactly the chipping away tactic that Craddock was hoping for. He ordered his fleet to sail northwards in a line measuring nearly 15 miles across, searching for the German cruiser. At exactly the same time, Spee was sailing south with his squadron in a line behind the Leipzig, searching for the Glasgow. Thus, absurdly, both commanders thought that they were hunting a single ship. At 4:20 p.m. on the 1st of November, The Glasgow spotted smoke on the horizon, and 5 minutes later she identified that smoke as coming from the funnel of the Leipzig. Oh, and the Scharnhorst, and behind it the Gneisenau. Craddock now faced an impossible dilemma: fight a superior force or withdraw. Yet maybe he was aware that Admiral Ernest Trowbridge was facing a court-martial for not engaging 2 German warships in the Mediterranean. Maybe he was filled with the fighting spirit of the Royal Navy. Or maybe he just calculated that, with no bases in the Pacific, if he did inflict damage on any of the German vessels, they would have to put into a neutral port and be interned, and thus effectively eliminated from the war. Whatever his reason, he chose to fight. By 5:10 p.m, his fleet, now in a single line, was sailing on a parallel course with von Spee, about 14,000 yards apart outside each side's gun range, just off the port of Coronel, Chile. At 6 p.m, he tried to force action, realising that with the sun setting to the west, which was behind him, it would dazzle the German gunners. He then tried to close range, but Spee turned away and, using his superior speed, kept his distance at about 10 miles apart, until the sun had sunk even lower in the sky. And now the tables were turned. Craddock's ships were silhouetted against the setting sun, whilst the Germans were lost in darkness with the South American landmass behind them. Just to compound Craddock's problems, the weather conditions were now starting to deteriorate. A strengthening wind was blowing up squalls and showers. It was now that Spee turned towards the British, closing the gap to 12,000 yards, and just after 7 p.m, the German cruisers opened fire with 12 of their 8.2-inch guns. Only 2 of Good Hope's larger guns were able to respond, and one of those was knocked out by the 3rd salvo from the Scharnhorst. Flames on the Good Hope now lit her up in the dark night, making her an easy target for the crack German gunners. Meanwhile, the Gneisenau concentrated her fire on HMS Monmouth, the Leipzig on the Glasgow, and the Dresden on the Otranto. Within minutes, the Monmouth was also on fire, and at the same time, the Otranto used her speed to pull away from the Dresden, but with her light armaments, was to take no further part in the battle. It became a desperate fight for the ships of the Royal Navy. In the dark and rough sea conditions, they could hardly see their opponents, nor could they see where their shells were landing. At this moment, Captain Luce on HMS Glasgow sailed between the Good Hope and the Monmouth and fired on the Scharnhorst, hitting the German, but with little effect. Craddock now tried to close distance to bring his smaller guns to bear, but as his flagship closed to less than 5,000 yards, it was taking hit after hit from the Scharnhorst. The British 6-inch guns were no match against von Spee's well-trained crews. The Germans were firing 3 shots to every British volley. And then suddenly at 7:50 p.m, the Good Hope's magazine exploded. A sheet of flame rose 200 feet into the air, and in less than 10 minutes she had sunk with all hands, including Admiral Craddock. HMS Monmouth, heavily damaged, tried to break away. Listing heavily, the Monmouth wasn't able to engage her guns, but her captain refused to strike his colours. The Nuremberg opened fire, and shortly before 9 p.m, the Monmouth capsized, sinking with all hands. The Glasgow and Otranto broke off and slipped away in the darkness. The Battle of Coronel was a major blow to the prestige of the Royal Navy, and a major boost for the Germans. Now, putting aside the fact that Craddock's ships were no match for von Spee's, it was nevertheless the first defeat for the Royal Navy in over 100 years. 2 British ships lost for no Germans. Over 1,600 British sailors dead, including Craddock, for not a single German sailor. In fact, in that whole ghastly nighttime battle, just 3 German sailors had been wounded. So, who was to blame for the first Royal Navy defeat in a century? It's been a debate that's lasted ever since the battle. I mean, did Craddock make the right call under the circumstances? Should he have fought or should he have fled? What about the Admiralty? Did their poor communications and lack of reinforcements, apart from HMS Canopus, put him in a no-win situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to know what you think. Interestingly, with the defeat at Coronel, the Admiralty were now able to dispatch fresh ships to the South Atlantic under Vice Admiral Sturdy. They included 2 modern battle cruisers, HMS Invincible and HMS Inflexible. Oh, and guess who joined them? HMS Defence. Strange that. Sturdy's fleet now headed southwards towards the Falklands, where the Canopus and Glasgow were waiting for them, to take on more coal before entering the Pacific to look for von Spee. But as fate would have it, von Spee was no longer in the Pacific, but, having rounded the Horn, was looking for a supply of coal. His destination? The Falkland Islands. But whatever fate had in store when they next met, the Germans' victory at the Battle of Coronel showed that after a century, Britannia might no longer rule the waves with quite the certainty that she always had. If you want to find out more about the Battle of Coronel, I've put some links to a couple of the books that I used in my research in the description below. Now, how about watching my video to find out all about the Emden's raids in the Indian Ocean? Thanks to Diane, Michael and Hans for supporting the show. And if you'd also like to become a supporter, then please click on the links in the description. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I'll see you again very soon.